focused on tribal control. And what he said as the chairman, he was voted in by the collective people, and therefore he was an embodiment of the local. Because the local people voted him in, he, as the tribal-centric actor, was acting in the interest of the local. So that's how he validated his actions. And so that same day, he signed a resolution that would move all schools under the oversight of the tribal nation. So rather than 7 tribal schools, he embodied it into one unified school system. So that was his effort, because he believed he was acting in the interest of the local community. So this move signified how the local community can be easily dismissed in the name of tribal sovereignty. So this was my setup for tribal nation goals. Now the other side, the local community-centric goals. So the local community-centric goals view tribal statecraft as a recentering of their community as autonomous from the tribal nation. That's what local communities believe, that we have our own history, we have our own community, we have our own stories, and that in that story that we have our own autonomy, and that we can't take everything from Winderock, that we can't take everything from the capital of whatever your tribal nation is. And so there's a rejection or a resistance to what comes down, because you believe in your community's autonomy, because ultimately you're the ones held accountable on whether or not your kids get educated or not, whether or not you can get enough food on the table for your kids. So that sense of autonomy and that feeling that you control your own destiny is localized. And so this is where local communities come from, that their stories matter. And the best way to capture this when I was reading was actually to go back to Linda Greyeyes. And she's criticizing colonial perceptions of of how the colonial people viewed tribal peoples. And I thought it was so amazing, because I thought her work was probably the most applicable to the local community experience. And she says that when in the nation, in the colonizers' eyes, that the way they perceive the Indians or the tribal peoples is that, as she says, we could not invent things. We could not create institutions or history. We could not imagine. We could not produce anything of value. We did not practice the arts of civilization. And in this case, the arts of nation building. By lacking such virtues, we disqualified ourselves, not just from civilization, but from humanity itself. I mean, to me, when I read this, I was thinking, this is exactly what I hear from the local community. This is what I hear when they're challenging their tribal leader who's not giving them the voice or actually articulating their issues, that their voice somehow feels really suppressed by tribal leaders. And so trying to think about, okay, what else are local community members thinking? I found a quote here that one tribe stated that the people in our community stated that their vote for the local community members reflects that the local is how they exercise sovereignty. So therefore, that these movements of the local ensures that the autonomy of the community is retained. And what this woman was describing was that, they didn't want to make any changes in anything they did, because the local is the tribe, and everything that happened locally reflected them. And so their autonomy was secured, and they didn't want to change anything, because that was the best system that reflected their own needs. So when she made that quote, I thought it was such a nice example of how to think about the local community goals. So this dichotomy of setting up the tribal and the local, I wanted to make sure that we think a little bit about these issues. But I also need to acknowledge the people who are squished in between. And I call them the goal setters. So it is also important to comment on the people who create these goals. Many times people imagine that goals of tribal communities are designed by the chiefs or executives of the tribal community. Instead, what is clear from these projects that these goal setters are, from the tribal nation side, are program managers, they're coordinators, they're specialists, and who don't participate in the political dramas of the tribal council. That they are foot soldiers engaging in the everyday engagement with their clients. that they design goals that match the demands of their clients. However, they also target and create goals that are hindrances that prevent them from achieving their own goals. So they're kind of living in a very, like, and I remember Dr. Minthorn saying she's very schizophrenic. She's working in 2 departments. And here, there's this idea of having dual expectations, dual responsibilities, that sometimes these goal setters feel that individualized pressure. But that's just my nod to goal setters. But what I was trying to do in terms of my summary of the tribal nation-centric goals and the local community-centric goals is to think about how to create a way of analyzing all this data that I was looking at. So what I ended up looking at was a federal grant program that happened that was given out to 10 tribes. And it was a $2 million grant, which was called the Sovereignty and Indian Education Grant. And this is a project that I helped to participate in as a federal agent, so it also gave me a chance to sit back and rethink everything that happened in this project, kind of give myself some time to reflect on whether was this project really a success. And to really make sense of things that were being articulated at the federal level by these tribal governments, and the process, how these engagements happened, what was happening at the community levels. But so this grant was really giving tribes an opportunity to build and think about, did they want to build their capacity by building an independent organization? Did they want to just solidify certain goals that they haven't been able to do in the past? So there was a lot of this project was literally seed money, it was research money to help tribes think about some of these issues. So what I did was I took the projects and the summaries that were made available publicly on the federal government's website from these projects and just looked simply at their goals. And so I wanted to try to assess how they considered and looked at these issues. And this was one of the meetings that we were at, where we had all the tribal leaders and the tribal coordinators. I mean, this is a pretty big room, but this is the best a camera could take in that space. But it was just the conversation that occurred there. So the study is centered around the information that was exchanged there. So I know I really wrote out the methodology in a lot of words, so I'll just really synthesize it. Here, the methodology is really trying to detect 2 things. Whether or not these projects were intended to protect the local, or whether or not they were intended to create uniformity and protect the tribal nation. So, in terms of the methodology, I kind of developed and explained how I did my analysis in looking at those 2 elements. So what I ended up doing was doing what I think some of you have already done in your research in the past, is using a content analysis of all those projects that they articulated just from the inception of the federal projects. But I also used these documents where I coded the goals, the accomplishments, and the challenges, but I also had some notes from presentations and meetings that were presented by these tribal entities. I did keep the listing of the tribal nations out of the analysis due to the small sample size, but I think here what I was trying to capture is that the story of the tribal statecraft is limited to those that felt compelled to submit a project grant. So this is not representative of all 567 tribes or even the 64 tribes that were eligible. This is only 10 tribes. So when you have such a small sample size, you generally try to do a lot of theorizing and try to think of frameworks and things that actually contradict what you approached it with. But here, it was helping me think about how do I pursue an analysis of those tribal and local goals. And the thing here too, I found myself is that I always use this term with my students, but I had to create containers, meaning, I had to contain what the local was described as in terms of my analysis. So, how do you bound the local? Because I think sometimes people say, well, is it a geographical boundaries, a linguistical? Is it people in the community who just identify with, that community? And, so there was a lot of things that I had to think about in terms of the local, but I left the determination of what local was based on what and how the tribal project articulated the idea of local. So, and the 3 questions that I did ask in terms of this were, what were the major differences between the goals? What are the major similarities between the goals? Are goals local community-centric, or are they central tribal government-centric? And how do they approach the validation of their goals? That last question I leave to the end because I didn't find a really clear pattern to address that, so I hypothesized at my conclusion with that. So what I did in coding this is I found a lot of certain themes that became centralized in these projects. So in terms of the typology of goals, things that were brought up was authority, decision makers, actions, will, knowledge and skills, tenure, capital, technological operators, and that's actually a term I'm using to capture what was articulated, and then the recipients. So these were common ways that people articulated both local and tribal-centric goals. And what I mean by authority is that in any community or tribal analysis, the question to the organizational agent is by what authority. So this statement is a recognizable feature of any tribal agent working to engage with other officials, both locally and tribally. So, you know, they had to make, like, statements were like, according to the Treaty of 1867, like, they had to state that in order to demonstrate their authority, or by Tribal Code number 18-3746, you know, the tribal education department could do this. So, you know, there were so many opportunities, so many moments where tribes who were creating these goals had to actually put that little operator in there to show that, you know, they had the authority. Which shows, you know, they're really cognizant that they're going to get a lot of pushback, that they're going to have to show to the rest of the world that they have this authority. Then decision makers. Yeah, so in these goals, they talked about decision makers in which who's authorizing your community. You know, so sometimes they said the school superintendent would, by the end of fiscal year 2017, would accomplish this, or the tribal chairman by the end of this fiscal year would accomplish this. So, you know, they listed and embedded in there the names of decision makers because, you know, again, it's legitimizing these goals. The actions describe really what the intent of the goals were, what action is taking place to accomplish a goal, but also the actions that represent the results of their goals. Will then describes the motivation and investment from the recipient, while aim describes the goal. So will, for example, is if they sensed or detected that there was no political interest. So they would say things like, we will present to every local school board, or at every chapter meeting, or at one of our district meetings. And so in a way, it was like they were trying to build that political will to support these initiatives because they were trying to do what in many political theory and social science terminology they call coalition building. They were trying to build people to be on their side. And then knowledge and skills. Sometimes it was about knowledge and skills. When you're building your nation, you're worried, do my workers really understand how to do this? Do they know how to achieve these expectations? So sometimes it was, we're going to offer training, we're going to encourage and create a pipeline of getting our workers going from you know, their bachelor's to a master's degree, that type of thing. So they were trying to boost the capacity of their members. Tenure just captures the length of the goal. Some of these were just within the grant period, and sometimes they were very long-sighted, saying 10 years we're going to do this, and 30 years we're going to do this. Some just said by the end of the fiscal year we're going to do this. So tenure is really important because I think sometimes when we talk about grants are only as successful as, you know, the amount of time that you're funded. After that, you know, projects die after grant initiatives. Then capital explains like the spaces and resources accessible to the entities. Sometimes it was like, you know, we're going to have new school construction by this period. We're going to have additional offices for our staff, those types of things. Technological operators are those who deliver the product, which just generally means that you know, certain workers would be identified to address these issues, and recipients are those who are receivers of the product. So, you know, trying to think and read through all these projects and coding it and trying to find themes of where are these guys, you know, talking the same talk. Where are these guys having a lot of similarities? But we're exactly, you know, trying to identify that commonality so that you can actually detect where the differences are. So this is the whole purpose of creating these themes, is this helps bring to the top where, you know, people have differing expectations about their community, about their tribal nation goals, about their local community goals. And then finally, the last part of this is, besides these themes, I separated them into tribal-centric or local-centric goals. So these were my results. So, I don't know how to do this. Here you see, what those codes were. Here, listed in this corner. Up here, we have tribal nation-centric goals, and then local community goals. So generally, these were how they were depicted. I also kind of did a thematizing again, but just for the sake of this presentation. Like when we talk about technological workers, who were they working? Who were the agents representing the tribal nation goals? And usually they were program managers or superintendents. From the local, they talked about teachers, staff, local school boards, administrators. Then the recipients, a lot of it talked about future leaders versus local communities with local goals were focused on as students. So capital, we're focused about building up our tribal office buildings and our federal buildings versus a local would be talking about school buildings or chapter offices. A tenure would be at a tribal nation level an election cycle versus at the local level it's career and long-term. So the knowledge and skills that they wanted to build at tribal nation level was policy development, policy implementation. The local-centric goals talked about curriculum, instruction, and assessment. The aim of the tribal nation was tribal autonomy, while local goals were community autonomy. The will was, you know, for re-election versus local sustainability. The actions were at the tribal nation, let's consolidate, let's unify, let's ensure our tribal control, let's build our tribal capacity. Versus local control-centric goals were local empowerment, local control, local capacity. Who were the decision makers? Tribal presidents, tribal delegates. And then decision makers that were local community-centric goals were locally elected officials. And then the authority, tribal code, tribal constitution, and then local control. So how often and how frequent? I mean, the best way to do this with a small sample size was really just to show how many times it occurred in those projects. So your range is from 1 project to 10 projects. How not the frequency that occurred in projects, but if it was mentioned at least once. So in these projects that I analyzed, 81 times, those projects focused on some type of tribal nation-centric goal. Versus in the local community-centric goals, it was 44. So the point of this analysis was to really help me think about how to create themes to understand this data that I was looking at. And this is really just to help organize some type of tool to help me think about future goals. So in terms of the research results, you know, the summary of my findings is generally that the strongest indications of tribal nation goals was tribal autonomy and improved policy development and implementation. So these two areas seem to be elements created by tribal nation goals. As noted in Table 2, I show how the occurrences for each code occur. So the next elements were references to improve tribal codes and constitutions, improve engagements with tribal and elected leaders, a consolidation of the local, and a sense of the constraints of time, because we have to work till the next election season. That action had to lead within an election cycle. So these are features and constraints placed upon the goal setting that promoted a tribal nation-centric goal. So when I looked at these projects, they were very tribal nation-centric. And why I think this is important to understand is you can understand why local communities view these creation projects as threats to the local community, because it's so tribal nation-centric. Then the local community-centric findings, so, just looking at where their strongest variables were, was that, they were very school-specific, that these goals had terms that targeted action that would impact students and their workers, teachers, staff, local school boards, and administrators. And they were very much about specialized skill sets, curriculum, instruction, assessment. And so, they wanted to build that capacity up through their knowledge and skills, but the strongest variables that showed was that they were really about, we need to do this now. So there was this sense of urgency that had to happen now and consistently from now to forever. So, so thinking in terms of the differences between the tribal and the local centric goals, I wanted to try to quantify and understand this process a little bit more. What time is it? Okay. So I'm coming to the end of my presentation. So what the results showed is that, a lot of this contention that happened, the feelings of threat, the feelings of the lack of support from the local community to these tribal-centric goals was really a byproduct of their own goal setting. And so in terms of this, I got a picture from a friend of mine who sent me this, and this is a protest of local community protesting the Department of Education. And they were upset because they thought it was promoting a certain agenda that conflicted with their agenda. And this was in the time period that this grant was received. So, and I think in terms of thinking of the tribe and the tribal nation, I wanted to try to show how the seeds of distrust are sown in terms of this process. So, there's evidence for that, and this is just kind of the research that I provided. The other part of my analysis that I hypothesize is just based on my engagement with tribes was, well, how do they collect these goals? Like, did they just sit in a room looking at their computer and type up the goals? How did they go out to the communities? And so I wanted to add this in there, and I can't prove this, but it was based simply, as they say, as economists call it, the window test. You look out and you're like, oh, it's nice and shiny, but this is just my window test analysis, and I have not proved this yet. So this is not an offense to anyone who's part of this project or anything, but what I observed is, and I'm going to use a lot of development, nation development terminology, is there was a lot of imitation and copying of goals. That the consultation was with either the federal or with the state, and that the research was very Western. They would look up things on Google or in their libraries. So, in terms of their method of inquiries, what was the process by which you acquired those goals? So this is kind of their method of inquiry. So what I'm proposing as a next step is to change how you do your inquiry. Because we talk about decolonizing, we talk about these theories, and I know Dr. Leola Tsinajini will be talking about decolonization later, but in terms of thinking about the future, how can we change how we collect information? And in terms of a decolonized agenda, I don't know what I did. But the goal of that is, rather than imitate, maybe do more remembering. So going back and getting stories. Rather than consulting with the state and federal, is to consult with the local, do more consultation at the local level. In terms of creation, dreaming. Dreaming about what the future holds and sticking to your guns in terms of what that dream holds. And then research, not the Western canon version of that, but actually using oral stories to help you do your research. But in terms of that method of inquiry, that's kind of where this project ended. So I really appreciate your time, guys, and I know it's about 11:59, so I just got 1 minute left. Thank you. Boyd, am I permitted questions?
Yes. Yes.
It's one more minute, but I just want to recognize the speaker's time. The next speaker.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. And I guess I was just wondering, and this may have come up in your content analysis, but how many women were in the room when those goals were being developed? You see here, we have a lot of women here, and I wonder if that would have any effect on some of the information gathering and some of those things. So I'm just curious about something you would like to look at.
Oh yeah, a majority. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. I will code for gender. No, I like that. Thank you.
I have a quick question. I'm wondering on the duration of these goals, because the election cycle, you mentioned that frequently. Some tribal nations have a yearly election cycle or an appointment cycle, like the governors and pueblos, versus nomination is a 4-year cycle. So.
Yeah, I only looked at whether or not they mentioned tenure as related to the time period of the elected official, the decision maker, and so it was dependent on however long they were in office. So, but you're right. I mean, I didn't code for the length of time because sometimes goals are very abstract. And we never really are that precise. So.
I know you, oh, sorry, scare people. I know you mentioned at the end of your conclusion there that to get down to the level of grassroots and to community, you mentioned about dreaming and taking their stories and pulling them out from who they are. Do you find, when we look at the area of dreaming, that colonization and our lack of these ideals that we need to incorporate, that could be a barrier?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think even I struggle with that. Even as a student, it took me some time before I actually read something like Laura Anseltua, who's not even a Navajo person, but she's, a feminist who thinks a lot about these issues of her own sexuality and things like that. And it took me reading that to actually have it hit me over the head and re-look back at our community and listen even better to my parents, to my mom and my grandparents, but also to listen better to the oral stories and creation stories. But I think in terms of always feeling like, I'm lugging around this colonial baggage, I think we all suffer from that. And I remember one of my students, when we were talking about decolonization, and he was like, do I have to walk around naked? Because, it's like rejecting everything that's westernized. I have to just be completely naked. And I think that's a negotiation that we all have to deal with. But I think what keeps these things in check is really about keeping that consultation with the local, engaging with your community members and listening, and being really patient.
So from your study, I was wondering about the actions. Do you feel that the actions oppose each other, like the tribal nation and the local community? I noticed you had 81 versus 44 occurrences, and could that be because of the corpus that was produced during your finding?
Yeah, that was a hard thing, because sometimes I think tribal nations feel compelled to mention the local, and even though they're thinking tribal nation focused, and sometimes I had to code for 12, those occurrences happened twice in one goal. that there was a local and a tribal-centric goal. But again, it was leaning more towards the tribal-centric. And maybe, I mean, there's a lot of limits to this. I can think of maybe 5 off the top of my head that, you know, it's a federal grant. It's going to a tribal nation. I mean, yeah, I can see those flaws there, but the thing is, the policies or whatever they're doing is impacting the local. So they have to think about how their actions is speaking for the community. So this is why I thought integrating the local aspect into it and evaluating from that perspective would be good. But I don't think it's social sciences or even native studies you're ever going to have a pure data set. You know, you're always going to know there's limitations. So, but I don't want to be disrespectful to the next speaker and to your meal, but I really appreciate you listening to me, and I'm going to sit right there if you want to come over, and I'll be here for the rest of the session. But thank you so much for your time, everybody.
Okay. Okay. Ooh, can you hear me? All right. Our lunch is here. You should have on your registration or your badge, you should have gotten a lunch ticket. So make sure that you have that with you when you go up and get your lunch. There's a person up there who's going to pick it up from you. There are 3 choices that you have. There's I believe a ham and cheese sandwich, turkey sandwich, and then there's salad. Yeah, okay. Anytime you want to go ahead and pick up your lunch, you can do that right now. We're going to try to stick to our schedule. From now until about 12:30, you can mingle and eat and talk and ask questions of Dr. Greyeyes and Dr. Minthorn and Dr. Marley from this morning. We're also going to announce those individuals that were selected for the poster, the signed poster. I didn't get a chance to show it up there when I was standing, but it looks like this if you look in my direction. Okay.
Just a few minutes, I guess.
All right, we'll announce the winners in a few minutes. Enjoy your lunch.